this is my personal view. I don't always want poets to be trained in secular spaces. I don't think pundits should only be trained outside the church. We think that, hey, come here, get your spiritual food, but to be excellent at what you do, go elsewhere to do that.
Welcome to My Boulevard. What's up? Welcome to the My Boulevard podcast. My name is Dhati Lewis. I am excited to be here. I am your host. I am here with my brother.
Let's go.
Baraka. And yes. So we are excited to connect and to talk about this year. Basically, I've kind of created a theme for My Boulevard. And this year it is this concept of live local. My hope is that every year, like throughout this year, that people will embrace the phrase, this is my boulevard. And when I think about this is my boulevard, I'm thinking about people that like, this is like moms, like with their children, dads playing ball with their kids, or reading bedtime stories, or like the practitioner, like on the job, the doctor at the surgeon, like all that. That's what I'm thinking about. And so, but a big part of it is really, how do we help pastors, people like me, people like you? How do we help them thrive in making disciples where they live, where they work, and where they worship? And so when I thought about that, I was just like, man, let's start off with who a lot of times when I'm thinking about engaging coaches, one of the first people that I go to is that's my brother. That's Show, and he's just kicked off this show called The Good Culture Show.
The Good Culture Show.
Right. And you just released your second episode.
Yep. Today
we
released the second episode. Yeah.
Right. So we just released the second episode. And so now, like, we are in this thing. Yes. And so tell me, like what is your hopes?
Yeah.
What are your hopes for The Good Culture Show?
It's a lot. I think of it as a couple tiers. One is to create content is the very basic tier. It's the on-ramp, right? It's some people would say it's the front yard.
Yep.
You just want to put things out there, people to laugh, people to think deeply, people to engage. And for folks to feel like there's a common place where we can kind of galvanize and connect. Like, oh, you share those sentiments. Oh, I share those sentiments too. Come around, we can hang out. So this is a community of thinkers, right? That, you introduced it with the P's that we are trying to develop, but talking about poets, polymaths, pundits, practitioners, pastors. You can think of a million others, but this is a place where we like to get, curious with creatives. We like to get thoughtful with theologians and pontificate with philosophers.
Yeah, we need a alliteration for pastors, because in this, I have wrestled, like, kind of my journey. I've pastored,
but I wasn't finished with my.
You wasn't done?
No.
Okay.
So that's the entry level.
Okay, there's
a deeper I guess you say goal. I don't know what the actual word was you asked me, but there's a deeper goal. So there's the entry level for people to be fascinated and pulled in. And if they want a more intimate, more, I guess you can say, a high level commitment to what does it look like to produce good culture, I'm kind of taking a page out of your book with you creating cohorts for pastors to, be healthy in how they plant churches. My thought is, why do we only do that for pastors? Like, why do we only think through how to cultivate pastors to plant churches? We need artists, we need thought leaders, we need creatives or marketplace leaders to think about their particular spaces as mission fields or communities that they're trying to plant as well.
Yeah.
And so what I want to do is create cohorts, create spaces, classrooms where people can come and engage, learn, and be sent off as well to create good culture where they are. So there's the initial, like, hey, here's this good content that be thoughtful, you can share on YouTube. But I'm also trying to create a space, a more intimate space where people can come through months, maybe a year, and develop and be trained to be sent out.
So it's sort of like from the corner to the classroom, or from the corner to the cohort.
There you go.
Right. And Absolutely. So you got that twofold. One is this kind of the public display, but then, hey, for those who want to be invited in, right, you can come and you can get that work. I love that. Because, and that's what I was saying, like you talked about, like the poets, the prophets, the pundits, right, the polymaths. And for me, I'm like, the more and more that I'm getting into. It's like, man, I would love to be for all of those people, and I am for all those people.
Right.
But a lot of times when I think about Jesus, he was just like, Jesus reached the masses through the men, right?
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it's just like, man, I'm more and more burdened, more and more grieved, more and more, designed for the pastor.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's just like, and really thinking about how does the pastor get beyond just simply creating something for the Sunday gathering, but the pastor for the everyday practitioner. And that's kind of where oftentimes when I think about that, I think about you, and I'm just like, man, help me think through culture, help me think through this shift, help me think about this. And I think the Good Culture Show brings that out, is like talking about a variety of different topics in a variety of serious, laughing, comedic, and so there's a lot of different things. And it reminds me of kind of like this wedding or this merging of multiple worlds. And oftentimes, I was thinking about your song Bethsaida, right? And in that song, you talked about like C.S. Lewis, if he can ever rap, right? You was talking about Nat Turner and Harriet Tubman, right? Like these people that seem like they don't fit, right? And so oftentimes we talked about, like, for you feeling like you're serious about the faith, but not feeling called to full-time pastoral ministry and never wanting to be a pastor. And I was just like, man, what would it look like for you to help me, to help pastors to think about people like you in their church? Right. And, tell me about that. Why is it important for us not to overlook those people? Because you say we do this for pastors, but why not for the artist, the creator? Like, I think
part of it is we don't know how to, because we think, I'm just sitting here thinking now, it's like the call is always to come to the church and then go out and do the work. But I think there are people who need to be equipped within the church, within those particular silos as well. Like, you don't always want, this is my personal view, I don't always want poets to be trained in secular spaces. I don't think pundits should only be trained outside the church. We think that, hey, come here, get your spiritual food, but to be excellent at what you do, go elsewhere to do that. And I'm thinking, like, well, what does it look like? And I praise God for, My Boulevard and Blueprint, because, and this is not just Blueprint, I think this is you in general. You've always created a space for the people who operate in skill sets outside of what you have to say, well, look, build a studio here in the church, figure out how to be the 116, go out and do your work. Same thing where we used to do the little TV series after Sunday that I created. Well, show, I don't know what you're doing, but here's some equipment, create it, and we'll show it at our Sunday, our weekly gatherings for the college ministry. And that was a place for me to develop skills in writing, acting, directing. And I was able to bring other actors, people who loved acting, people who wanted to write, people who wanted to work behind the cameras. And that was, if we're honest, we probably learned, I think about myself, Aaron, Kristen, in college, we probably learned more on those sets than we did in actual classes in school. And that was the church giving us the opportunity to do that. And you see more people who are actually creating spaces within churches for folks to be creative or to be thoughtful. The AND campaign, in a sense, though it's not a church, it's a Christian institution that's trying to say, hey, how do we train political operatives or pundits to go and engage the world? Because the world's going to teach them a certain philosophy, a certain preference. We want to give them the tools on how to be political literate within the paradigm of Christianity and send them out. And so I think that's how pastors can partner and say, how do we create space for people to be excellent in what they do? Because they're not competing, right? As long as you can figure out how to integrate it with the mission of the church, I think it's great. And sometimes the pastor is going to have to say, you know what, I had a view or a vision, maybe we need to change it. And the artist sometimes have to do the same, or not the artist, but the individual has to come and say, you know what, I wanted to do this, but maybe I had to figure out how to integrate it into the life of this church. And that's how you mutually benefit, because now it's not just one person trying to pimp the church for their resources. It's like we're being mutually beneficial or benefited in this relationship. I'm giving, I'm also receiving, I'm being used, but I'm also, being useful.
So let's I love definitions, and I love kind of like not a formal definition, but just kind of making sure that we're speaking clearly. Like when I think about like the form, when I think about like the idea of the pastors, right? I think about pastors, I'm thinking about it in a more generic term, like people who are called to be responsible for shepherding God's flock. That could be deacons, pastors, elders, leaders, but people who are called to full-time ministry, called to lead a local congregation. Amen. But you've talked about concept of pundits and poets and polymaths and prophet, you know. So give us a quick kind of like understanding of each one of those. Yeah. And then basically so that we can better understand these categories and how you're thinking about them.
So I don't necessarily talk about those particular labels in simply vocational like paradigms, because you could be a poet and not actually be a poet. Like, you know what I mean? I think of people who are just creative. How do they tackle problems? How do they operate? What is the primary gifting in which they operate? Are they creative? Then you have people who are prophetic, people who just speak to, that can be literally people who are prophets within churches or people who are just activists. Yep. Then you have the polymaths. Polymaths are just people who are entrepreneurial, people who just do a lot of things. These are people you just can't, they always have an idea. Yeah. It's just like, hey, let's do this. It's like, all right, well, let's figure out how to come alongside you. Hundreds of people who just give great commentary to society. These are your thought leaders, your politicians, fill in the blank. And so I think about how do we galvanize those people to be accessible within the church? How do pastors, and sometimes I put pastors and prophets in the same, how do we put those people under the tutelage of the church so that they can be equipped not only for the work of the ministry within the walls, but also outside. Right. And so those are the definitions that
I think that's important because right now, and again, I'm going to say something that's controversial and I don't want to diminish it, but because I think it's really important, but oftentimes we'll find those the polymaths, the pundits, those P's, and we'll say, hey, can you greet on Sunday? Right. And then it's like, that's their role on Sunday. And I just feel like, man, this is so much is being underutilized of how God has made them. Yeah. And that's what I'm saying. Like, I don't want to diminish at all hospitality. It is so important. Yeah. And it's also important to have a mindset, man, pick up the broom and do whatever the church is needed. So I don't want to, that's what I'm saying. I don't want to but how do we help pastors to think beyond that, to simply, all right, man, if you're an accountant, if you're good with business, can you count the money? Yeah. Like how can we unleash?
Very practical thing that you've done recently, I think has been helpful. There's two things. One, you recognize that one of the things that I love doing is galvanizing people to kind of teach creatively, whatever. So Issachar Lectures is a way that you've done that. And so you said, hey, how can we utilize the skills that you have to benefit not only you, not only is it a way to promote these things outside of the church, but this is also equipping our church. Yeah. You know, the goal is to get our church people to understand culture. And so I'm saying, what are the things that I feel like are important for our church to wrestle with? And so I pick topics, I pick things that I think are pertinent within not only our local context, but our global context. And I either teach on it or I bring people who are authorities on those particular subjects to speak on it. And I find that a lot of churches would probably struggle to do that because the pastor wants to control everything that's being communicated. Yeah. So that's one simple way that a pastor can do is like, hey, what is something that someone is excellent at doing? How can we integrate that into our church that I don't necessarily have to do? Because, pastors are elders and they don't want to add another thing to their plate. Do you trust this individual to be able to take the wheel to steer it properly? And so therefore people are being equipped. You're giving folks opportunity to champion something, but you don't have another thing on your plate. The other thing is good culture. I know that I love just being creative. I love thinking through ways of communicating difficult things in a creative way to disarm people with comedy, satire, etc. And one of the things that you've done is say, hey, show, we did it at the conference. He was like, you need to be doing this regularly. And so having a space where I can do that regularly, And though it's not a part of the church, the Sunday programming, it's not a part of any kind of real calendar within our church, people in our church are involved. So you get folks who are wanting to learn how to work on cameras, to work behind on production, people who love writing, people, and you just bring them into this space and say, hey, this is a production that we're putting on regularly. You're going to learn skills, you're going to have fun and engage. And then the people who participate, whether in interviews or on the game show, are people who are a part of our church as well. Now, it'll get to a point where it'll probably outgrow just this church community, but the church will always be connected to this thing.
Right.
And so that's another just simple thing that, you know, people can, and that you've done. And it's always going to be different for the next pastor.
So how do you do stuff like that, and how pastors and they're just like, man, we're already limited on resources, and not lose the mission that we're doing by doing all of this? How do you keep the guardrails? I like to think of like when you were playing, when you're bowling, like when you pull up the rail so that if it bumps to the right, bumps to the left, it kind of stays within the lane.
And I think the even the benefit of that analogy is, though, even though you may not hit a strike, you're going to hit something.
Right.
And the problem is with me, and I think you helped me out with this, is that I'll always want to get a strike every time. And it's like, so we're not going to hit a strike because we don't have a budget for a strike. But what we could do is just hit a couple of them. Yeah. So think through, how can you make what's the most effective show with that's economical? Yeah. And we've done that. What equipment do we have that we can execute this? How can we get people who can volunteer to do certain things? How much time can we commit to this? And what is your actual bandwidth to pull this off? Yeah. And so you think about the overarching goal, you think about the resources you have, and you start to eliminate, well, we can't do that. Because I was like, let's do it every week. It was like, well, show with this budget and your time and capacity, we can't do every week. So we're going to do it every so often. All right, boom, there you go. Who's on your team? All right, how many people on that team can volunteer? Okay, how many people need to be paid for their time? All right, well, here's the budget. Well, can't pay that person. Find somebody else and you just, the process of elimination to get to a place where and even within what we've established before we shot the first episode, had to scale down from there. Mm-hmm. I was like, all right, we need 2 days to edit. Now I'm realizing we need 3 days to edit. Yeah. you know, so it's just stuff like that. You have to set realistic goals and then maybe even scale back from there.
Yeah, that's good. So in that, are you like, when you are doing the show, let's talk about like the show and the purpose of the show, and how do you think the show is going to help the everyday Christian, or even help the pastor? Like when you sit and you thinking about what you're going to talk about, how are you going to come out? Like, what is
you think about a sermon? The sermons have a purpose. Sermons are trying to preach to the heart of the people from a text. Yeah. And God does wonderful things through pastors by preaching through text. But if we're honest, that there is limitations to that. You can't really dive deep into, because whether it's just people will get bored if you get too academic, people will complain because it's too much comedy. It's like, teach the word. Stop telling us jokes. Yep. I've actually had somebody tell me that at church one time. It was like, we didn't come here for a comedy show. And I was like, oh, wow. Okay. Right. So, you're limited with a talk show or with a show. You can do whatever you want, and you can touch on topics in a way that a pastor probably shouldn't. Right. May be afraid to.
We don't use the word should on this show.
Okay, probably could
choose a different
path. Could choose a different path.
Yes. This could continue.
So so there are alternative means of communication that I think benefit the body of Christ that a Sunday service can't. Yes. And I think that is beautiful, in the same way that Christian hip hop was able to usher in a new modality that gospel music could. Yep. You have 16 bars. Actually, you have 48 bars. Now people don't have 3 verses, but you had 48 bars to communicate something, where in most songs you only had 12. Yeah. And in that 12, you would repeat over and over because there were particular structures. In a sermon, you usually have 30 minutes to, in your case, an hour. to preach a sermon.
That was a jab.
But
you know what's so funny is that you just educated me, because like when you said 16 bars, I never understood what 16 bars was. Like what that meant.
Yeah, it's a verse.
Like I never knew. I never thought about that. And then you, like, I was going to ask that, and then you threw that jab about the hour long. But it's okay. I'm okay. I'm starting to embrace who I am.
That's the one thing that's very Black church about you, is that you hold on.
Hey, I got something to say.
You got something to say. Amen. Come on now.
I got something to say. You know. So I oftentimes I think about like the picture of me and you as kind of the two different worlds, in the sense of, like, again, I'm not like the traditional pastor, but like I said, my heart is for pastors. I want to see pastors to think differently about church, but I want pastors, and also, I think about you are like, will do everything in the world to run from any type of being called a pastor or an elder, or
just know that I appreciate, though. I have great respect for the office. That's why.
Yes. Okay.
Because I defiled the office, and I was like, I don't. So like, if you just take a picture of me, because people ask me, hey, did you rap or whatever? I was like, no. Like, God gave all of the musical talent to my older brother and my younger brother, and not me. I was just like, that creative thing. I said, my creativity comes in like coaching and, like, you took most of the athletic talent, though.
Yeah.
I thought I was, and then I tried, and it just wasn't quite, but
yes. Well, I mean, that was it. That's why I poured it into to that. And so, but when I think about kind of even the differences of how we approach politics, how we approach ministry, how we approach like even the ministry. And that's what I love about kind of what you're bringing with Good Coaches Show to even My Boulevard, and spreading it beyond. Is it's like the worlds and the perspectives, the vantage points. Because I think we have similar beliefs, but we come at it different ways.
And this came to mind, and I want to say this before I forget it. I think the other thing that's beneficial about a relationship like ours is that, and I didn't appreciate it at first, and I'll come back to this. I'm about to say this. It's like the Du Bois Booker T relationship that I think a lot of people mischaracterize today, and we read it with our own political perspective. But I think individuals like yourself, you know who you are, and like, I don't have to be everything. And I don't know when you got comfortable in your skin in that. But I think sometimes pastors try to not only be a pastor, they try to be the politician. They also try to be the artist. And it's just not good. It's not a good look, first of all.
Yeah.
Because it's like you look corny trying to be this, but also you're exhausting yourself. I can imagine like Moses, Jethro's like, look, bro, you need to figure out how to delegate this responsibility to elders. And I think one of the things I think you've done well is, I know I do coaching well. I know I'm a visionary, but there are certain aspects of engagement. There are certain aspects of teaching. Here, let me pull these people in who do this better than I do so that we can have a well-rounded church. And I think too many pastors are trying to either, one, they try to do too much. Two, they either don't trust people enough to be able to play those roles in their life, or they don't have those people around them who could be a resource to them. And I've learned that I don't have to only be, one, you referenced Bethsaida on that album. I talk about there's more Booker. There ain't a lot of Booker T when you look at me, but a whole lot of Du Bois making noise. Well, that album was 10 years ago. And as I've matured, I realized, like, man, Booker T was onto something that I think a lot of us can learn today. That doesn't mean that Du Bois's political posture and his goal of trying to shake up the political landscape and speaking truth to power was wrong, but it also means that Booker T's goal of trying to build an institution and teach people how to be practitioners is also not wrong.
Yeah.
And how do they partner together? Because in a lot of ways, Booker T actually financially supported Du Bois. And so the problem is we pit these things together against one another when they can be in partnership.
Yeah.
And I think the same thing with the cultural engager, the person who's a polymath, or the person who's this with the pastor, and say, how do we make this church a more healthy place? Like, and I'll shut up because I'm talking, like the way that a lot of pastors back in medieval time were poets as well. They were people who who engaged songwriters. And so the church was the mechanism that employed people to do great art. And now we've allowed there to be a market who determines that.
Right. And I think we farmed, and as pastors, we have farmed that out to somewhere else. And we have made the church centered around just pastor teachers.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Right. And oftentimes, even for myself, because I would consider myself more apostolic, right? An apostolic teacher, and then pastor, kind of in that order. But it's just like, but the church is around pastoring and teaching, like care for the soul and teach them the word. And then there's this kind of like, but every other thing, farm everything else out to other people. Right. And so a lot of times, the old school saints used to say fivefold ministry. Yeah. Now we say the APEST, it's just the apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, teacher. Yeah. But I think oftentimes, especially in kind of in our journey, in our story, I was like, God used the evangelists and prophets of our day, which were the artists, to get the gospel into the cracks and the crevices and the places. And then after that, it was just like, as people were being raised up, they felt like orphans. Yeah. And it was like, that's when God was like, man, we need to raise up pastors and deacons to come alongside to make sure that maturity. And I think that, and then what, we pitted one another and we cannibalize in a sense. And then we say one's not needed, or either the institution's not needed, or, they too wild. Like, and there's just like that tension.
Well, my concern is that when that was done, and I've seen it in my own life, is that the prophets, the evangelists, those folks who went outside and saw that their gifts were useful in the marketplace rewarded them more than the church did. Yeah. And so they felt like, well, I'll just stay out here. Yeah. And that is is disheartening, but it's also discouraging, because eventually those individuals will find like the market is not kind.
Yeah. Yeah. One more thing before we wrap this up, because I think really there's a couple of things in my mind, but when I think about the distrust in the church, like we just went through like the pandemic, the COVID years, we went through all of the stuff, the people leaving the church, all the things that takes place, and just not just Blueprint, but just as a whole, right? I'm starting to meet more and more people who had left, and they're coming in. It's like, man, this ain't working either. Like me by myself, isolated in my room, is not working. I haven't had community. I'm lonely, but I'm also still not coming back to the church. And there's been a distrust, and I have some theories around that. I feel like this was one of the first times that, like in our history, whether we agree or not with what the church has been saying, like there was always a voice. But over the COVID and all that, like we were silent. Like the Black church, the church, period, it was silent. And we allow, regardless of where we stand on people like BLM and other, they were the voice. And there was no, even like a Reverend, Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson, regardless of where we agree with them theologically or not, there was always the church throughout the history of America has always had a place. But if we were to say over the last 3-4 years, who was that for the church, right? Whether anybody speaking or even trying to speak on thus saith the Lord, right, in the time. And so I think that void and that absence was just like, in my worst of times, the church had nothing to say. In the hardest of times, in the loneliest of times, there was nothing to say. And throughout all this stuff, there's nothing to say. So, but now, but instead, when we do talk, we're fighting against one another about some foolishness. So I guess my question is to you, people have talked about that they're deconstructing because of that. But now when people are starting to reconstruct, it seems like the local church is not a part of their reconstruction. And so you hear a lot of people say, I'm going back to God, but I'm still not going back to the church, right? Talk to me a little bit about, especially again, for people that are more like in the polymath, the pundits, they're finding meaning and purpose outside of the local church. Tell me why you think that is, and what can we do as pastors to try to bridge that gap?
Well, let me first, that's a lot. Let me first go to I think the problem with people speaking in desperate times, like where are the voices? Where are our voices during these seasons of turmoil? I think it's hard because to say that no one is speaking, and I know you don't mean like no one,
Right. Yeah.
but CNN, who's allowed, like who's on CNN speaking?
Right.
I think the thing we have to be very mindful of is CNN is going to propagate the people they want.
Correct.
And so we don't have the platforms. This is the reason why we need Booker T's.
Right.
We need people who are going to build institutions that will allow us to collectively come together. And that's the problem, because like you said, we struggle to do things collectively. Collectively come together and say, because of course there are thousands of people who were speaking during that time period, but did they have a swell of folks behind them to say, when I say we're going to go, we're going to go? Like, no, there's no MLK, there's no SNCC, there's no SCLCs out there right now who are speaking predominantly for a particular contingency of Black Christianity, all right, or even the church. And if there are people who are speaking for the church, it's causing more division because those folks are like, well, I don't agree with that.
Right.
Right. And that this goes to your second point, the question about deconstructing, is because people don't trust institutions.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's all fair. I think some of it is fair. I think some of it is because institutional power has historically corrupted, and it still corrupts today. And there are human beings behind institutions. And because we're flawed, the human beings use the institutions for particular purposes. And not always are those purposes, I guess you can say, vile. It just marginalized particular people. So, you have a church who's like, we are all in for pro-life.
Mm-hmm.
We want to stand behind pro-life. And folks are like, well, bro, what about the mother who needs health care? What about this? And what about that? Therefore, I can't rock with your your pro-choice. Sorry, I keep saying pro-choice, with your pro-life banner or agenda. And so it's like, because it seems not to be a comprehensive view of pro-life. And so that's just an example. And so therefore people are like, well, therefore I can't trust institutions. And so therefore I'll run away. And I think the unfairness is that we want perfection without sacrifice. We don't think people are going to, we want things to be perfect, but we don't realize that we ourselves aren't perfect. We call for justice, but when justice has its aims pointed towards us, we're like, grace, right? But we're not willing to extend that same grace to the people who are leading these institutions. And it's, there's a lot of philosophy or theory out there around the spider and the starfish, and that's why people should decentralize government or institutions, and we should just be people who operate in our own particular mechanisms, and so BLM is one. But we've seen the issues with that, right? It's hard to mobilize people, and when there's an issue, who's the person that we go to, right? So it can be chaotic. There are always pros and cons to everything, but I've found that people are realizing that there's error, and they're deconstructing without reconstructing something helpful. People, the C.S. Lewis has this, or I can't remember if it's Chesterton, but one of those wonderful, brilliant Englishmen. They say that the point of seeing through something is to eventually see something. You can't keep seeing through a thing. The point is to see through something to land at a particular point. And I think some of us just deconstruct just to deconstruct, and then we just leave a wake of mess in our travels. And it's just like, well, what are we leaning on? What is the truth? What is the principle that we're leaning on? And if it's nothing, then there's no point of me even leaning on the gospel of Jesus, because if the gospel of Jesus is calling us to fellowship and community, and to trust in one another for our growth, and if we're not doing that, then there's a problem. And I feel like there are those out there who are like, you know what? I'm trying to give this fellowship a better or another chance, and it's going to take time, because I just think people have had distrust with of institutions as long as we know. So I don't know if this is a new thing. It's a new phenomenon with our generation and the generation that's following. But ultimately, I have found that some people are taking that step back. All right, well, I need community. I need people to be around. And maybe it's not church, but I need people there. And hopefully at some point they'll say, well, I can't just do fellowship with just a community of people who love Jesus. We have to be a part of the commands of which Jesus calls us, and the writers of the Bible say, hey, you need structure, you need organization towards this fellowship in order to get things done. And this is the last thing I'll say. The reason why I think the church and the institution is helpful, as we see in Acts and we see it in different places, is because these people get things done. Yeah. That's the reason why people would line themselves with political parties. It's like, man, I don't believe everything that this political party, but if I want to get my bill passed, I have to rub shoulders with other Democrats. I have to rub shoulders with other Republicans. Like, hey, man, I'll have to vote for your thing. Okay, cool. But here, I really want to get this voters' rights bill passed. Same with the church. If you want to create real community, you need to be a part with people who have similar visions. Some people use other mediating institutions like nonprofits, but ultimately the church should be that institution where people say, hey, how do we get this done? Yeah. How do we come together to get this done?
That's good, man. This is great insight. And I'm really thankful because as we start thinking about specifically people that are not all in on the church, right? Yeah. Whether it's the polymaths, the pundits, the prophets, the poets, right? That they were finding other things to attach themselves to. Part of what my hope is that I could help the pastors, bring alongside people like you to help the pastors to say, hey, here's an option. It don't have to be the only option, but here's an option that we're making room for those people to say, man, that both the church needs you and you need the church. Yeah. And so it becomes a symbiotic relationship in the sense of like it's mutually beneficial for the flourishment of the gospel, for the flourishment of God's glory.
What I would encourage you to these pastors too is not to, I used to struggle with this in college when we had a college ministry. It was, my goal was always to get the popular kids. If I can get the football players and the popular ones to the Bible study, everybody's going to go. It's like, and you waste your time chasing them around. And then there are a whole bunch of faithful people who's like, yo, I wanted to spend time with you, but you didn't spend time with me.
And that's actually the reason why I taught a lot of heresy is because I was that football player. I came in, like I was saved for about a good 2 months. And it was like, hey, come here, brother. Yeah. Why don't you get up and lead this study and do this? All right, bro, man, this is my boulevard. We want people to embrace that phrase. Yeah. This is my boulevard, whether you're a poet, you're a prophet, you're a pastor, you're a pundit, or whether you're a polymath, you do it all, right? Some of us have 5 gifts. Some of us only have 1. And so I'm going to stick with my 1 and stay in kind of that pastoral. But we appreciate you, like we really believe that if we make disciples locally, we will make an impact globally. Like our hope is that through this podcast, through this time, that you will be able to say, this is my boulevard, and we will give you helpful tools to helping you make disciples where you live, where you work, and where you worship. All right. Until next time, we'll see you. Peace.